In the Somali region of eastern Ethiopia, Abdidov's truck carries a lifeline. After more than 2 years without rain here, his liquid cargo is worth its weight in gold. So Abdidov's work never stops. He's been delivering water since yesterday morning. Hassan travels from village to village across the arid Somali desert, bringing life to communities on the edge of survival. This is the first water the people in Birleis have had in weeks. These women usually walk 20 kilometers every few days to collect water, but that's no longer an option. The closest source is now a river over 70 kilometers away. So the truck is their only hope. Not a drop is wasted. Most of the families here have already lost everything to the drought. These people are desert nomads. They are used to harsh conditions. But the drought forced Markab and her family to leave the bush and set up camp here, next to the road, where there is at least a chance water will come.
abaaro badan waa u soo joogtaan u malayn haye
abaaro badan waan u soo joog
haye
abaartan oo kale weli ma derderin weli ma ana derder wax un baa dadku u hadhahay oo lagu noolaan hay hadda wax la qaadqaadaa leeyahay.
As we arrived in the village of Gabi'as, Ashir Mahdi was dragging yet another animal carcass to the edge of town. Locals tried to keep the rotting remains away from their homes.
haye
Dozens of dead animals now litter the outskirts of the village. The few animals left might not survive much longer. Abdi Ahmed works for the local government. His job is to assess where the drought is hitting hardest. I joined him as he met the latest arrivals to this makeshift camp.
Assalamu alaikum.
He knows these people are on borrowed time unless the rains come.
saddexdii waqti roobaadka la soo dhaafay roob ku filan oo ka diin maxay deegaanka.
Assalamu alaikum.
As we were talking, 84-year-old Abla approached us to tell a familiar story.
xageed ka timid
dadkan yacdada isla kulmaan oo nag weeye dadkii baa beega loo yaaban yahay.
With water and food now so scarce, officials are warning of an impending famine here. And at the hospital in Godey, we saw the first signs.
qiyaasaan markii ugu horeysay markaan arki jiray ama 9 ama 10 bisha hadda 25 30 mararka qaar xataa waxaan soo martay ilaa inta in ka badan ay gaarayeen marka intii hore in ka bedelan baa yaad saameynta abaaraha jira daraadeed ee numberku aad u soo badaneen.
Many of these nomadic mothers traveled hundreds of kilometers to get help for their children. They are all malnourished, their mothers too, making breastfeeding almost impossible. Nasteh is just a year old.
أنا حوالي كل رايح.
يعني هدي اللي ويعرض تخلعه.
بس عيالك نفق الآن باخده. يسبق بح.
Later that morning, Ethiopia's Minister of Health, Dr. Leah Tadesse, arrived for a lightning tour.
So
She and the UN dignitaries nodded solemnly at a few patients before their expensive motorcade sped off for another photo op. The Ethiopian government has a more pressing issue. The ongoing civil war in Ethiopia's northern regions has diverted the focus and resources elsewhere. Add to that a growing global food crisis and limited aid supplies. But with more than 13 million people across the Horn of Africa in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, unless it rains soon, the area could see the worst drought in 40 years.
That report from Jamal Osman. Now, the World Food Programme is one of the main providers of food in countries suffering famine and acute hunger. Its chief economist, Dr. Arif Hussein, joins me now from Rome. Dr. Hussein, I wanted to get your reaction first to what you've just seen in Jamal's report there.
I mean, you know, it's terrible, and unfortunately, that's the reality of this world right now. Whether you're talking about East Africa, whether you're talking about West Africa, whether you're talking about Southern Africa, whether you're talking about Middle East, and essentially what you're seeing is that there are like 4 C's, if I can put it that way, in play. First and foremost, you have conflict. You're showing Ethiopia. Conflict is a big deal over there. The second one is climate crises. You're seeing it time and again. Again, what you showed, it is about climate, it is about droughts. The third one is about consequences of COVID itself, the economic consequences. And then fourth one is the rising costs. What we are seeing is that in many, many parts of the world, all of these things are culminating into a perfect storm,
Right.
which is creating situations like Ethiopia.
And so talk about that perfect storm. You name-checked several countries there. Give us a sense of the scale of how many people around the world are facing the prospect of famine.
So this is before Ukraine. We have about 276 million people in 81 countries who are in what we call a hunger crisis, of which about 44 million people are in what we call hunger emergencies, meaning one step away from famine. And it's not in like 1 or 2 countries, we're talking dozens of countries. I mean, I can name you, you start from Yemen to Syria to Sudan to South Sudan to Ethiopia to Afghanistan to Central African Republic and I can keep going on and on and on. And that's what's happening right now.
And when you hear those figures, which are shocking figures, how far short is the World Food Programme of the money that it needs? And what is your call to the wealthy nations about, how they need to step up?
So we are about, if in 2022, we need to assist about 145 million people. That's about 50% of the big numbers that I talked about. And in order to do that, we need about $20 billion. Right now, our forecasts show that we would have just about 10 billion. So we have a 50% gap in terms of what we need and what we think we will get. And that gap has severe consequences around the world in many, many countries where we have to cut very basic rations left, right, and center. I mean, that's what is happening as we speak. And the Ukraine war has just put fuel on this raging fire.
And so put it in stark terms, if wealthy nations don't add that extra $10 billion, what are the implications in terms of people's lives?
Look, there are 2 things. One is what happens inside the countries. You will see children die, you will see men die, you will see women die. We have barely kept people alive through COVID. Don't forget, these things don't happen in a vacuum. So we were already dealing with COVID and its consequences, and people are kind of like squeezed out because of COVID and rising prices before Ukraine, right? So there is no safety nets left for many millions of people around the world.
Yeah.
And when you don't have safety nets left, what are the choices? Either starve where you are, or migrate or displace and go to someplace else. and that is also, I mean, the time when you start to see destabilization of countries, you start to see destabilization of regions, and you see an increase in terrorism. People become more radicalized.
Dr. Arif Hussain, thank you very much for joining us. Well, a short while ago, I spoke to Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat, who's chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I began by asking whether the West is in danger of forgetting the plight of millions of people in Africa.
Well, the warning from David Beasley, the head of the World Food Programme, has been extremely clear over many weeks now, which is that not only is Ukraine a disaster area in itself, but as it grows about 10%, maybe a bit more, of the world's wheat, corn, and various other foods, this has huge knock-on effects for places in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East.
Well, the World Food Programme says it just doesn't have the money that it needs to bluntly feed the children of Ukraine and the children of Ethiopia, for example. So do wealthy nations have to redouble the amount they're giving to the World Food Programme as a matter of urgency?
Well, I think we've got to look very carefully at the requests coming out of the office of the chief exec of the World Food Programme, the director of the World Food Programme, because the warnings he's making are extremely clear. And what he's stating quite categorically is that the implications are not just in Ukraine and the number of people who now need emergency aid who didn't only 4 weeks ago, quite a remarkable act of brutality by Putin's regime. But also the food that they're looking to buy on the international markets that would feed people in places like Lebanon and Sudan and Libya is now even more expensive than it was.
So in that context, when you think about your own government's breach of its manifesto commitment to spend 0.7% of gross national income on international aid, I know that you didn't support that decision, but does the government need to rethink that manifesto breach as a matter of urgency?
Well, I long believed that the importance of the commitment is not the percentage, but the effect. And the reality is that it's quite clear today that the effect we're likely to see if we don't support those who are in the greatest need is one that undermines the stability of the British people. It doesn't just lead to famine around the world, which is horrific in itself, but it also leads to the consequent horrors of human trafficking and people movement. And we need to be absolutely clear that what we have an interest in is stable societies who are able to see their own prosperity grow.
From where you're sitting, if you stand back and you look at the crises in Ukraine, you know, we've talked a lot about Afghanistan, and we're talking now about famine in parts of Ethiopia. Is there a sense that political leaders around the world, particularly in the West, can't sort of manage all of those crises all at one time?
Well, I'm afraid you don't get a choice. I mean, the reality is you've got to be able to walk and chew gum. And if you're the leader of a major global economy today, you just need to deal with as much of it as you can. Now, I think the challenges are severe. That's true, but they are ones that we can cope with if we deal with them together.
Tom Tugendhat, thanks very much.
Thank you.